It all started with a single online listing, an old, forgotten mountain cabin perched above the misty ridges of Pinecrest Valley. The photos were faded, the roof sagged slightly, and ivy climbed the weathered logs like green veins reclaiming the wood. But beneath the decay there was a charm that called out, the kind of silent promise only a place with history can give. After years of working in the city, surrounded by noise and neighbors stacked like boxes, the idea of restoring a cabin in the quiet mountains seemed like freedom. The listing price was suspiciously low, but the deed was clean. A quick trip to the county office confirmed it had been abandoned for nearly a decade after the previous owners passed away. The property taxes had been paid off by the state, and it was now part of a foreclosure auction. The moment the auctioneer's gavel hit the block, I became the new owner of what the locals called the Ridge House. It was mine, all 30 acres of sloping pine forest, mossy trails, and a view that made the world below look like a watercolor painting. The first drive up there was both breathtaking and unnerving. The gravel road wound sharply through the woods, flanked by towering pines that whispered in the wind. Deer watched from the tree line as my truck climbed higher, and the air grew colder with every turn. When I reached the property gate, a faded "No Trespassing" sign hung crookedly, half buried under vines. It felt symbolic. A barrier between what it once was and what it could become again. The house itself was smaller than I imagined. 2 stories, dark-stained wood, stone chimney, and a porch that leaned just enough to make it creak with age. A single swing still hung there, swaying slightly even though there was no wind. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and time. Old furniture sat covered in white sheets, and the faint scent of pine mixed with mildew. Despite the decay, it had soul. You could almost feel the memories echoing in the walls. Laughter, warmth, family. That was the kind of energy I wanted to bring back. The next few days were a blur of cleaning, hauling, and planning. I spent the night sleeping in a cot near the fireplace, listening to the mountain's nocturnal chorus, the crack of branches, the distant call of owls, and the sigh of the wind through the trees. The loneliness was strange at first, but it was peaceful. It was only on the 3rd day that I noticed something odd. Footprints, fresh ones. They were small, not mine, and they led around the side of the cabin toward the back fence. At first, I assumed hikers or hunters had wandered too close. It wasn't unusual. Mountain trails ran close to private properties all over Pinecrest. But when I followed the prints, I noticed something more disturbing. Cigarette butts scattered near the shed and a half-empty bottle of soda. Someone had been spending time here recently. I changed the locks that night and made a note to install cameras once the power lines were reconnected. Still, I didn't feel uneasy enough to leave. It was my property now, legally and rightfully. By the end of the week, progress was visible. The porch had been repaired, the windows washed, and sunlight once again poured into rooms that hadn't seen daylight in years. I'd even met a few locals in town who congratulated me on buying the haunted house. They said it half-jokingly, but I could tell they meant something by it. Apparently, the previous owners, an older couple named the Hargroves, had died unexpectedly one winter, and their children never returned to claim the property. Some said the family had fallen apart after the tragedy. Others hinted there had been disputes about inheritance, but no one knew for sure. That night, as I sipped coffee on the porch, I thought about how quickly things fade from memory. A house that once held an entire family's life could so easily be abandoned, forgotten, left to rot. But I wasn't going to let that happen here. The next morning, I woke to the sound of an engine, faint but close. My first thought was a delivery truck or maybe a neighbor. But when I stepped outside, I saw an old silver SUV parked by the gate. 3 people were standing beside it, a woman in her 50s with a sharp bob haircut, a man with a scruffy beard, and a younger woman with arms crossed tightly. They weren't smiling. I called out to them, waving politely, but they didn't respond. Instead, they just looked at the house, my house, as if it had been waiting for them. The older woman began walking up the gravel path with a kind of entitlement that immediately set off alarms. Her expression wasn't one of curiosity or interest. It was ownership. The man followed, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes scanning the porch like he was inspecting a repair job he'd once done himself. When they reached the steps, the woman's first words weren't a greeting. She asked what I was doing there. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. But her tone, cold, clipped, authoritative, made it clear she wasn't asking in curiosity. She genuinely believed she had the right to know. I explained calmly that I was the new owner, that I'd purchased the house legally. But her expression hardened even more. The man beside her let out a low laugh and muttered something under his breath, and the younger woman rolled her eyes. The older one, Karen, as I would later learn, looked straight at me and said the words that would mark the beginning of everything that followed. She said that this wasn't my house, it was theirs. Her parents had built it, she claimed. Her family had lived here for generations. According to her, the sale was invalid, the deed was fake, and I was trespassing on her family's land. For a long moment, I just stood there, unable to respond. The audacity was unreal, but so was the certainty in her eyes. She believed every word. They turned and left after a few tense minutes, but the way they looked back at the house as they drove off made my stomach twist. That was not the last I'd see of them. That night, I found new footprints in the mud by the back door. The lock on the shed had been forced open, and on the porch swing, someone had left a single, faded photograph, an old family portrait of the Hargroves, smiling in front of the same house I now called mine. The edges were torn, but on the back, in shaky handwriting, was a single word: home. The morning after I found that photograph, the air felt different, heavier, colder, almost charged with something invisible. The mountain mist hung low, curling between the trees like slow-moving smoke. It was beautiful, but for the first time, the place didn't feel peaceful. It felt watched. I spent most of the day checking locks, walking the property line, and making sure nothing else had been disturbed. The shed door, which had been pried open the night before, was now hanging crookedly from one hinge. Inside, some tools were missing, mostly small things like a hammer and a flashlight. But the most unsettling part was the smell. A faint trace of cigarette smoke lingered in the air, fresh enough to make it clear someone had been inside only hours ago. That evening, I called the county sheriff's office to report the trespassing. The deputy on the phone was polite but unconcerned. He said they'd send a patrol by when possible, but out here in the mountains, that could mean days. I tried to shake it off. This was rural land. Things moved slowly. I figured Karen and her family would get bored once they realized I had paperwork to prove ownership. But I underestimated how far obsession could go. The next morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps again, this time deliberate and close. I jumped out of bed and went to the window. Down by the edge of the property, near the gate, a group of people stood facing the house. I recognized them instantly: Karen, the bearded man, and the younger woman. But now there were more. A couple of older men, another woman holding a small child, and even a teenage boy leaning against the SUV. They were standing like an army, motionless, silent and defiant. I stepped out onto the porch, my heart thudding in my chest. They didn't speak, just stared. Then, as if it had been rehearsed, Karen turned and walked toward the house again. Her boots crunched on the gravel. She stopped a few feet away from me, eyes sharp and unflinching, and held up a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of an old deed. Faded, nearly illegible, but I could make out the family name, Hargrove, and the same property address. She said they were here to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. I tried to reason with her, explaining that this was a foreclosure property, that the state had repossessed it years ago, and that the auction was public record. But she didn't care. She said she didn't recognize the state's authority over her father's land. The others behind her murmured in agreement, their faces twisting with resentment. Before leaving, she told me that if I didn't vacate within a week, she would take matters into her own hands. That phrase stuck in my head for the rest of the day. By evening, I noticed their SUV parked just outside the property line again. Its headlights were off, but I could see the faint glow of cigarettes flickering in the dark. They were watching, waiting. I started documenting everything, photos, timestamps, written notes, in case I needed to take it further. The sheriff still hadn't come by, and I was starting to understand why the locals had warned me about the Ridge House. There was something personal about this conflict, something that went beyond property rights. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. Tools began disappearing again. The trash bins were overturned in the middle of the night. One morning, I found muddy footprints on the porch and handprints smeared across the front window. It was subtle, but deliberate, like they were marking territory. Then came the noise. Every night, just past midnight, I would hear a faint tapping sound echoing from the woods. At first, I thought it was a branch in the wind, but it grew rhythmic, measured, almost like someone knocking. Sometimes it came from the left side of the house, sometimes the right, as if whoever was doing it wanted me to know they could circle the cabin freely. The anxiety crept in slowly, like fog seeping under a door. I stopped sleeping soundly. The once inviting creak of the porch became a warning sound. I began to dread the stillness of night. It was during one of those restless nights that I caught them. Around 2 a.m., I saw flashlights flickering through the trees. I grabbed my phone, turned off the interior lights, and peered through the curtain. 3 figures were moving near the shed again. I hit record and zoomed in, Karen, her brother, and the younger woman. They were unloading something from the SUV, boxes, maybe tools. They moved quickly, like people who knew exactly what they were doing. After a few minutes, they disappeared behind the shed. When I finally went out there the next morning, I found new tire tracks leading deeper into the woods, toward the far side of the property where an old service road ran along the ridge. Following the trail, I discovered something that turned the situation from creepy to disturbing. About a half-mile from the house, hidden by thick brush, there was a clearing, and in the center of it stood 2 old RVs, rusted and patched with duct tape but clearly occupied. Laundry lines hung between trees. Smoke rose from a barrel fire. It was a makeshift camp. Karen and her family weren't just visiting, they had moved in. It was surreal, people living on my land, acting as if I were the intruder. I took more photos, recorded the campsite, and drove straight into town to report it. This time, I insisted on seeing the sheriff directly. When I explained the situation and showed the evidence, his expression darkened. He admitted he knew of the Hargroves, said they had caused trouble before when the county tried to reclaim foreclosed land. Apparently, they believed the government had stolen property from their deceased parents. The sheriff promised to send deputies up to talk to them. That evening, for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. I even started unpacking supplies again, determined not to be scared off my own land. But just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I saw a new sign hanging on the gate, crudely painted in red across a piece of plywood. Hargrove property. Trespassers will be removed. It was nailed directly over my legal property marker. The deputies never arrived that night. Instead, as darkness fell, the faint orange glow of campfires lit up the trees beyond the ridge. Laughter drifted up the slope, low, mocking, and disturbingly familiar. I realized then that Karen's family didn't just believe they owned this land, they were reclaiming it, piece by piece, while I watched. And the mountain, once so quiet and serene, suddenly felt like it had turned against me. The next chapter of this battle wasn't going to be about paperwork or phone calls. It was going to be about who could outlast the other, me or the family that refused to let go of the past. The days that followed were a descent into chaos disguised as normalcy. I tried to go about my renovation schedule, repairing beams, sanding floors, clearing debris, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every swing of the hammer echoed through the forest, and I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere beyond the tree line, a pair of eyes was tracking every sound. By the 3rd morning, the once silent mountain had changed. There were noises, faint music drifting from the ridge, the rumble of a generator, the crackle of a campfire. Karen's family wasn't just camping anymore. They were settling. The makeshift camp I had discovered had grown into something more permanent. I counted 2 additional tents, a tarp-covered structure that looked like a cooking area, and a small satellite dish attached to one of the RV roofs. Their SUV came and went several times a day, and each time it did, a new sign would appear closer to my cabin. Private property, Hargrove family. Keep out, family land. And then one that sent a chill straight through me. Last warning. I finally drove down to the sheriff's office again, a folder of printed photos in hand. I wasn't leaving until someone took this seriously. Inside, Sheriff Clayton sat behind a cluttered desk, his expression tired. When I explained the situation, the camps, the threats, the vandalism, he sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. He said he understood, but these things were complicated. According to him, the Hargrove family had filed a claim of ancestral right to the property. It wasn't legally valid, but it was enough to create a dispute that required review. That meant the county couldn't remove them without a court order. I stared at him in disbelief. They were trespassing on my land, and the law was giving them time to dig in deeper. He said he'd send someone up for a civil standby in a few days, but for now, he advised me to avoid confrontation. They can get volatile, he added quietly, as if warning me not just about legal trouble, but something darker. When I drove back up the mountain, the sun was setting, painting the trees in long orange streaks that bled into the fog. My gate was open again. The plywood sign still hung crookedly, but now the lock on the chain had been cut clean through. Inside the property, I noticed new tire marks in the dirt and muddy boot prints across the porch steps. When I stepped inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of smoke, not from my fireplace, but from outside. Through the window, I saw a faint plume rising from the woods. They were burning something, probably trash, maybe wood, but the sound that followed wasn't fire. It was laughter. It came from deep within the trees, rolling and loud like a group celebrating something. Then faintly I heard it, music. Old country music, twanging and broken through a speaker carried by the wind up to the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the pines made me flinch. I kept thinking about what the sheriff said, volatile. What did that mean? Had they done this before? At dawn, I walked the perimeter again. Near the edge of the woods, I found what they'd been building, a fence. Rough, uneven logs nailed together in a crooked line, running right through my property and out toward the ridge. They were sectioning off the land like it was theirs again. A few yards beyond the fence, I saw something else. A freshly painted sign hammered into the ground, written in red, Family Cemetery, Do Not Disturb. There was no cemetery listed in the county records. I checked again later that day. It was a fabrication, a trick to make the land seem sacred, untouchable. The audacity of it was staggering, but it was also clever. Any disturbance of a claimed burial site would trigger an automatic investigation, freezing all property disputes. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. I decided to install trail cameras, hidden ones this time, deep in the trees, facing the road, the fence, and the shed. If I couldn't get immediate help, I'd at least build a record of everything. That night, as I reviewed the first few clips, my stomach twisted. The footage showed Karen's brother walking right up to my front porch around midnight, flashlight in hand. He didn't knock. He just stood there staring at the door for nearly 2 full minutes before turning away. The next clip showed Karen herself, early the following morning, pacing near the fence line. She stopped several times to look directly toward the house, like she knew there was a camera, daring me to see her. They wanted me to feel trapped. Later that afternoon, I decided to confront them. I didn't plan to argue, just to set a clear boundary. I walked down the path to the edge of the clearing, camera in hand, phone recording in my pocket. When I arrived, the entire family turned to look at me at once. Karen stood at the center, arms folded, that same air of defiance radiating from her like heat. Around her, children played near the fire barrel, and the younger woman stirred a pot on a camping stove. It looked less like a squatter camp and more like a settlement, a family reclaiming something they truly believed belonged to them. When I told her she needed to leave, her eyes didn't even flicker. She just smiled, a tight, bitter smile, and pointed to the family cemetery sign. She said I was desecrating sacred ground, that she would call her lawyer, and that soon the truth would come out. Her confidence wasn't bravado, it was conviction. That night, as darkness fell again over Pinecrest Ridge, a storm rolled through, fierce and unrelenting. Wind howled against the windows, rain lashed the cabin, and thunder cracked like gunfire over the valley. But over the storm, I heard something else. A knock, slow, deliberate, 3 times. When I opened the door, no one was there. But nailed to the porch railing, soaked through by the rain, was another photo, an older one this time. It showed the cabin decades ago, freshly built, the Hargrove family standing proudly in front of it. And in the bottom corner, written in that same jagged handwriting as before, were 3 words: "We never left." The storm raged on outside, and I sat in silence by the fire, the photo trembling in my hand. It was no longer about property lines or paperwork. This was turning into something else, something territorial, primal. They weren't trying to win the land back through logic or law. They were claiming it through presence, and the longer they stayed, the more the mountain itself seemed to side with them. Morning came late to the mountain. The storm had left the forest drenched and heavy with fog, every branch dripping, every footstep muffled. But even before I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The silence was too deep, that eerie kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. When I stepped outside, my worst suspicion was confirmed. The gate was wide open again. The plywood sign that claimed Hargrove property had been replaced overnight by something larger. 2 nailed-together planks painted with bold red letters. "Private land, under family occupation." Below it, pinned crudely with a rusted nail, was a photocopy of that same fake deed Karen had shown me earlier. The air smelled like smoke again, faint but constant. I followed it down the slope toward the shed and stopped dead in my tracks. My truck, the only vehicle I had up there, had been vandalized. The windows were smashed, the tires slashed, the hood spray-painted with a single word: thief. It was deliberate. Not random vandalism. A message. That was the morning I stopped feeling like an owner. I started feeling like an intruder. The sheriff's office, when I called again, sounded tired of me. The deputy's tone was polite but detached. He said they'd filed my complaint, but there was no evidence that directly tied the Hargroves to the damage. Without video proof, there wasn't much they could do. They could only mediate, not enforce, so I did what I could. I boarded up the broken truck windows, reinforced the cabin doors, and tried to focus on the one thing I could control: the documentation. Every photo, every sign, every camera clip went into a folder on my laptop. But the more I reviewed the footage, the more I realized how invasive things had become. At night, the trail cams caught movement, not just near the fence or the gate, but around the house. Faces appearing at the edge of the frame, half hidden by the trees. Figures creeping closer with each passing night. Sometimes a flashlight beam would flash across the lens and blind it completely. The message was clear. They knew I was watching, and they didn't care. The footage also revealed something else: construction. In the clearing beyond the RVs, the Hargroves were building something. Wooden beams, tarps, even concrete bags hauled up from the road. It wasn't just a camp anymore. It was becoming permanent. A second home. By the end of that week, I could hear hammering echoing through the woods at all hours. The rhythm of it was unnerving, relentless, as if they were staking their claim with every swing. Then came the dogs. Late one night, I was jolted awake by barking. Deep, aggressive, close. I rushed to the window, flashlight in hand. 2 large dogs stood near the edge of the porch, growling, their eyes catching the beam in an eerie yellow flash. Beyond them, I saw shapes, human silhouettes, watching from the dark. When I shouted, the dogs didn't back away. They just growled louder until a voice whistled from the woods, calling them off. By morning, muddy paw prints covered the porch. That's when I finally understood what they were doing. They weren't just trying to scare me away. They were conditioning me, wearing me down inch by inch until the cabin no longer felt safe. Until I started thinking about leaving. And truthfully, it was working. The isolation that had once been peaceful now felt suffocating. Every gust of wind made me tense. Every snapping twig outside set my nerves on edge. I began sleeping with the lights on, a flashlight beside my bed, and a camera feed open on my laptop screen. Then, one afternoon, I noticed something missing. The property deed, the official document I'd kept inside a locked drawer, was gone. The drawer was pried open and the deed folder was empty. The lock wasn't broken, just neatly picked. There was no sign of forced entry otherwise, which meant someone had been inside while I was gone. On the kitchen table in its place was another photograph. This one showed Karen standing on the same porch, smiling. Her family surrounded her, and in her hand, she was holding up my deed. Scrawled in marker at the bottom were the words, "Back where it belongs." That night, fear gave way to fury. I was done being quiet. I gathered every photo, every timestamp, every clip, and drove into town determined to make the sheriff take it seriously. I arrived unannounced, stormed through the door, and demanded to see him, but Sheriff Clayton wasn't there. His deputy said he was out on a call. When I explained the situation, the deputy looked uncomfortable. He finally admitted that the Hargroves had filed a counterclaim, saying I was harassing them. They'd accused me of breaking into their camp, taking photos of their children, and trying to steal family artifacts. It was absurd, but legally, it complicated everything. Now the case was in mutual dispute status, pending review. No arrests, no evictions. Just a recommendation that both parties avoid contact. I drove back up the mountain in silence. The sun was setting when I arrived, painting the forest in that eerie orange glow that made everything feel like a dream. Except this wasn't a dream. It was a slow nightmare. At the gate, I found a new addition, a mailbox nailed to one of the fence posts. Inside was a handwritten note on lined paper. "We appreciate you keeping the house warm. We'll move in soon. Save us a room upstairs." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. That night, the sound started again, not just outside this time, but inside. Creaks on the floorboards that weren't mine, whispers, or maybe wind, slipping through the old wooden walls. At one point, I could swear I heard a door latch click shut in the hallway. I checked every room, flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing, no one. But when I came back downstairs, the fire I'd left burning was out. Completely out. The ashes were cold. Too cold. Someone had been here. Recently. I sat on the porch until dawn, staring out into the mist, waiting for them to show themselves. They never did. But as the first light broke over the ridge, I saw smoke again. This time, not from their camp, but from my shed. By the time I reached it, it was too late. The roof had collapsed, tools and wood smoldering in the ruins. Someone had torched it during the night. The air reeked of gasoline. I stood there watching it burn, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I thought about leaving for good. Not because I was scared, but because I was starting to realize the truth. The Hargroves weren't going to stop. They didn't want to reclaim the house. They wanted to reclaim the mountain, and no matter what the law said, they believed it already belonged to them. The morning after the shed fire, the mountain was eerily still. The air hung thick with the smell of burned wood and wet ash, a sour reminder that nothing here was under my control anymore. The tools I'd collected, the lumber I'd stacked for repairs, all gone. The shed, once a sign of progress, was now a blackened skeleton of charred timber. I tried to convince myself it was salvageable, that this was just another setback. But deep down, I knew it was the beginning of something worse. I walked the property line again, checking the trail cameras. 2 of them were gone. The mounts had been ripped right off the trees, and one of the remaining cameras had its lens cracked. The last one still worked, and when I reviewed the footage later, I saw exactly what I feared. At 3:12 a.m., 3 figures walked across the clearing toward the shed. One carried a gas can, another a lighter. The camera caught the faint flick of flame before it turned black. There was no doubt who it was, Karen's brother, his son, and that same younger woman. Their faces were unmistakable. I printed stills from the footage, attached them to my growing file, and drove to town again. This time I didn't go to the sheriff's office. I went to the county courthouse. Inside, the clerk behind the glass window looked startled when I dropped the folder on the counter. I explained everything, the vandalism, the threats, the fire, the trespassing, and demanded an injunction, a restraining order, anything. She flipped through the papers slowly, expression unreadable, then sighed. She said she could file it, but it would take several days to process. I asked her to hurry, but she only said, "The Hargroves are known around here. It might get complicated, that word again. Everyone in this town seemed afraid of them." When I left the courthouse, the weight of isolation pressed harder than ever. There was no help coming. No law, no backup, no neighbor willing to get involved. It was me against a family who thought the mountain was theirs by birthright. By the time I got back up the ridge, I realized how quickly the situation had escalated in just 24 hours. They had moved closer. The Hargrove camp was no longer hidden in the trees. It had spread. A new tent, a makeshift clothesline, even a small wooden shack taking shape on the slope below my cabin. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the woods like a pulse. It was as if they were building a small village, and the cabin I lived in was just one piece of it. The audacity was stunning. But what chilled me most was their confidence. They didn't sneak anymore. They didn't hide. They waved when I walked by, slow, deliberate, mocking waves. That night, I nailed boards across the doors and pushed furniture against the windows. The cabin, once a place of peace, had turned into a fortress. Every creak of the old floor made my pulse jump. The mountain's sounds, wind, branches, distant owls, blended with the new noises of hammers and laughter drifting up from below. Then, a new sound joined them, music. Old country songs again played on repeat, louder than before. It carried through the trees, distorted and ghostly, a soundtrack to my exhaustion. I realized they were keeping it on through the night, not for entertainment but as a form of harassment. It was psychological warfare. By dawn, I hadn't slept at all. The constant thumping of bass lines mixed with the chirping of morning birds. I stepped outside, half-dazed, and saw something that made my stomach drop. The front porch swing, the one that had always creaked in the breeze, was gone. Just the rusted chains remained. Down by the path, lying in the mud, was one of its wooden planks with a message burned into it. Home sweet home. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to understand their endgame. Were they trying to scare me into leaving so they could take over completely? Or was this something deeper? Something almost ritualistic? The longer they stayed, the more it felt like they weren't just reclaiming land, but restoring some twisted version of their family's legacy. By midday, the sound of a vehicle broke through the stillness. I looked down the dirt road and saw an old pickup truck pulling a trailer. On it were boxes, furniture, even a rusted fridge. The Hargroves were moving in. I called the sheriff again, nearly shouting this time. He promised to send someone up, but no one came that day, or the next. By the third day, their new structure had walls. Smoke rose from its chimney, and at night I could see the glow of lanterns through the trees. Their presence became inescapable. Even the animals seemed to vanish. The deer that once grazed near the cabin stopped appearing. The birds grew quiet. The forest itself felt tense, as though it recognized a new power had taken hold. That's when I started hearing the footsteps. They came after midnight, soft, deliberate, circling the cabin. Sometimes near the porch, sometimes near the back door. Every time I stepped outside with my flashlight, the sound stopped. But once, just once, I caught sight of a figure slipping between the trees. A small child, barefoot, staring back at me before vanishing into the dark. I barely slept that week. I started leaving lights on around the cabin, even setting up small makeshift alarms, pots and string near the doors, motion lights by the path. But nothing could shake the feeling that the line between my space and theirs no longer existed. Then one evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Karen stood in the clearing below the cabin, holding something high in her hand. At first I couldn't see what it was. Then the wind caught it, and I recognized the shape. It was my mailbox. She had ripped it from its post, painted over my name and written Hargrove in dripping black letters. She placed it on the post at the edge of their camp and turned to look directly at me. There was no shouting, no threats, just that silent, victorious stare. It was the moment I realized I was already being erased. The next morning, I found another note slipped under my door. "You're just a guest now. Be gone before winter." The handwriting was messy but familiar. The same jagged scrawl from every photo they'd left. Winter in Pinecrest was brutal. Once the snows came, the mountain became inaccessible for months. Supplies had to be stocked, power was unreliable, and travel was nearly impossible. If they were planning to stay, they were preparing to outlast me. That night, as the cold crept through the cracks in the walls, I realized the mountain wasn't mine anymore. Not in any real sense. The papers might say otherwise, but ownership meant nothing out here. The Hargroves had reclaimed their foothold, and I was living on borrowed ground. The first snowfall came early that year. It started as a thin veil of white dust drifting across the ridge, soft and harmless, but by midnight, it thickened into a storm that swallowed the forest whole. The trees bent under the weight of ice, the wind howled through the pines, and the mountain turned silent beneath its frozen mask. For a while, I thought the storm might finally drive the Hargroves out. No one could endure winter up here without proper shelter, power, or supplies. I'd stocked up months ago, canned food, propane, firewood stacked high under a tarp. They, on the other hand, had nothing but tents and that half-built shack. But by the third day, I realized I was wrong. Through the blowing snow, I saw smoke rising from their camp again, thicker, darker. Somehow, they had found enough fuel to keep a fire burning around the clock. At night, faint orange light flickered among the trees like restless spirits. They weren't leaving. They were settling in. The storm raged for nearly a week. I spent most of it sealed inside the cabin, listening to the creaks and groans of the old beams as wind battered the roof. My generator ran low, the pipes threatened to freeze, and every sound outside carried a weight of paranoia. When the snow finally eased, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. I stepped out into a world transformed, everything buried under deep, untouched snow. The road to town was gone, buried beneath drifts taller than me. My only connection to civilization was the radio, and even that had gone quiet. Then, from somewhere down the slope, I heard the sound of an axe, steady, rhythmic. Thunk, thunk, thunk. I followed the sound to the edge of the clearing, careful not to be seen. What I saw made my chest tighten. Karen's brother was chopping through a fallen pine, stacking the logs beside the shack. His breath fogged the air in steady bursts. The others were moving around the structure, reinforcing the walls with sheets of old metal and salvaged boards. They were building stronger, not weaker, and then a new addition. Smoke rose from a chimney. They had finished the roof. The Hargroves weren't surviving the storm. They were thriving in it. That night, the forest was unnervingly alive. I could hear their voices, muffled laughter, a woman singing softly, the clink of bottles. It was domestic, almost normal. Except that this was my mountain, my property, and I was trapped watching intruders build a home within sight of my window. The next morning, I noticed something else, footprints, dozens of them, winding through the snow, circling my cabin like a pack of wolves. Some stopped just short of the porch. Others led to the shed's ruins, but one set, smaller, lighter, went all the way to the back door. Something had been left there. When I opened the door, I found a single frozen object on the step, a snow globe. Inside it, a tiny log cabin sat beneath glittering white flakes. Someone had written a message across the base in black marker. "We belong here." I didn't touch it. I just stood there staring as the wind howled down from the ridge. I knew then that the confrontation I'd been avoiding was no longer optional. That night, I loaded my truck. I didn't plan to leave, and not yet, but I needed to be ready. I gathered my documents, the photographs, the footage, and everything I'd collected since the first day I met them. If something happened to me, I wanted proof to survive. The cabin was quiet until near midnight. Then came the voices again, closer this time. I looked out through the frosted window and saw faint figures moving up the hill, lanterns in hand. 5, maybe 6 of them. They weren't sneaking anymore. They were walking straight toward me. The first knock came heavy. Not a polite tap. A pounding that shook the door on its hinges. I stayed silent, hoping they'd leave. But they didn't. The knocking grew louder, more impatient, then stopped. Seconds later, a voice echoed from outside. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't angry. It was calm. Too calm. Time to go, it said. The door rattled again. I grabbed the flashlight and the metal poker from the fireplace. My breath fogged in the air. The handle twisted, then snapped. The door creaked open. Snow blew in through the gap, swirling across the floor. For a moment, I saw no one, just the white blur of night beyond. Then Karen stepped into view, her face pale, her coat dusted with frost. Behind her stood her brother and 2 others, silhouettes against the storm. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. I raised the poker, my hands trembling. My flashlight caught her face, and I saw something that wasn't anger. It was conviction. She truly believed this mountain belonged to her. When I shouted, when I finally broke my silence, they didn't flinch. They turned and disappeared into the blizzard, leaving the door swinging open behind them. I slammed it shut and barricaded it again, heart pounding. The rest of the night passed in fragments. I must have drifted in and out of sleep because the next thing I remember was waking to the sound of roaring. Not voices. Not the wind. Fire. I stumbled to the window. The Hargroves' shack was burning. The flames were massive, clawing at the sky, devouring everything in their camp. The snow around it hissed and melted, black smoke twisting upward. For a moment, I thought they might have fled. But then I saw movement near the blaze. Shadows darting, figures shouting. A woman's scream pierced the night. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and rushed outside. The snow was deep, the cold brutal, but I ran anyway. When I reached the camp, the heat of the flames hit me like a wall. The structure was collapsing, and the air stank of smoke and wet pine. Karen was kneeling in the snow, crying out for someone inside. Her brother and nephew were dragging out what was left of a burning cot. I realized then that their youngest, the barefoot child I'd seen, was trapped. I didn't hesitate. Together we pulled the debris apart, the flames scorching our gloves. I found the boy near the back, coughing, dazed but alive. I carried him out, set him down beside Karen, and stepped back as the structure gave one final groan and collapsed in a burst of sparks. The fire burned itself out by dawn. No one spoke. No one moved. The Hargroves sat in the snow, their home reduced to ash, just as mine had been weeks before. When the sheriff's snowcat finally crawled up the mountain 2 days later, he found us all there. Karen didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply said the mountain had taken back what it wanted. They were escorted off the ridge quietly, without incident. I gave my statement, handed over the files, the footage, everything. The sheriff promised charges would follow. But as he drove away, I noticed Karen looking back through the frosted window of the snowcat, her expression unreadable. That was the last time I saw her. Months later, when the snow melted and spring returned, I walked down to where their shack had stood. Only a blackened patch of earth remained. But near the edge of the clearing, something had grown, wildflowers, bright and yellow, pushing through the soot. I don't know if the mountain was cleansing itself, or simply reclaiming what was always its own. The locals still talk about the fire. Some say it was an accident. Others whisper that the mountain made its choice. As for me, I rebuilt slowly. The cabin stands stronger now, the fences replaced, the paths cleared. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the trees, I swear I can still hear that old country song, faint, distant, carried on the air, and every time I hear it, I remember Karen's words, "We belong here." Maybe in a way she was right, but so do I.